Hi, my name is Robbie Raphael Day. Welcome to the Deep Accessibility Podcast. This will be a research episode. We're going to talk today about web accessibility and look at the history of it. So, in my work, I argue that we need deep accessibility for people with specific needs, and especially with intellectual and developmental disabilities. This community has specific needs with respect to using the internet or using any device in general to have more independence, be able to have more self-expression, self-advocacy, etc. So in this episode, we're just going to look through some articles through Google Scholar and run them through a language model. We're going to be using Claude because it has the best context window, and I think it's a really good way to understand some material. So in these research episodes, I just want to take you guys through my process and that way be able to show you what I do and how I put information onto my blog as well. All right, so I'm interested in knowing about the history of web accessibility. I'm going to take a look at this article from 2001. So critical theory, it's from 2010, it says right here. So critical history of web content accessibility through 2001. It's cool how you can listen to it as well. Let's look at the PDF. Okay, and download this bad boy. All right, this is a full article. Great. So first of all, I'll just look at, looks like our abstract here. This paper takes a disability studies perspective on the history of the development of web content accessibility policies in the United States using procedural documents, popular press accounts, and policy documents themselves, augmented by personal interviews with the key participants. I sketch a critical history of accessible web development. First, I argue that the World Wide Web Consortium accessibility guidelines and U.S. government Section 508 standards emerged out of a confluence of three trends: the ongoing work on telecommunications accessibility, the increasing attention to the civil rights of people with disabilities under a social model of disability, and the development of an enthusiasm for the internet and the web. A key tension can be traced through these historical processes, as both documents grappled with concepts of accessibility as it related to usability, universal design principles, and disability status. In my analysis of this tension, I used the recurrent theme of variation to develop a productive and progressive notion of disability. By centering variation, accessibility can address a range of bodily differences, including but not limited to disability, and create a variation create a more inclusive cultural and political sphere online. Finally, I argue that variation has also proven productive for theoretical models of disability and for new media studies, and thus it may hold great promise for the future expansion of accessible web content across a variety of sites and Web 2.0 services. Keywords: cyberculture, digital divide, disability, media studies, and law. Okay, so let's check this out. Go ahead and upload this guy in. Okay, and then I'll just ask it, tell me a brief outline of the document. All right. So often it'll just give us a basic outline of what our abstract was before, but we can start asking it questions. Okay, so they mentioned in the paper about universal design, and universal design is something that I am a little bit critical of. I think that we can do better than universal design. So I argue for deep accessibility, which means that we are looking at how to meet a specific community's needs from start to finish. And with the community that I'm interested in, that is very important because we want to be able to create independence if possible. So I will ask here, so tell me about the paper's discussion of universal design. Okay, so here's a great definition right here. So it says, in the early 1990s, advocates like Susan Brummel promoted universal design as an alternative to just retroactively accommodating disability. Universal design calls for systems to be flexible and usable by the widest range of people from the outset. So that term right here, widest range of people from the outset, that's a little bit what I'm arguing against. And I think it's great. I think this is definitely a step up from accommodating after the fact. During the WCAG development process, members tried to link accessibility and usability using universal design principles. The idea was to go beyond just assisting people with disabilities and make the web usable for all. Yeah, so make the web usable for all. I'm going to ask about that part. Can you tell me specifically in the paper where it talks about making the web usable for all? Please provide direct quotations as well. Okay. Let me keep reading here. So the popular press began adopting universal design technology in the late 1990s, showing more nuanced understanding of accessibility. The author argues variation is a more productive focus than universal design. Oh, this is interesting. For reconceptualizing access, while universal design is well-intentioned, focusing on all users can erase the specific needs of people with disability. Yeah, that's actually a little bit more, that's exactly what I'm arguing, essentially. The author suggests variation allows valuing disability as a form of human difference, not just accommodating it. This could lead to more inclusive online participation. That's a great point right there. I'll ask about that in a minute. There are two direct quotes from the paper discussing making the web usable for all. So when discussing the WCAG 1.0 development process, in addition to usability, universal design perspectives offered an alternative to simplistic notions of access or accommodation. In 1994, the N2 white paper, Brummel wrote that universal design calls for the development of information systems flexible enough to accommodate the needs of the broadest range of users of computers and telecommunication equipment, regardless of age or disability. Okay. When introducing the final WCAG 1.0 guidelines, in the abstract, complicated notions of access and user variation are visible. The primary goal of these guidelines is to promote accessibility. However, following them will also make the web content more accessible to all users, whatever user agent they are using or constraints they may be operating under. Okay, so let's go back to this concept that was said above about variation. Okay. Can you tell us more about the author's discussion of variation? I am wanting to know how we can make the web more accessible for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Okay, let's check that out. Okay, WCAG 1.0 recommended using simple language to make content more accessible for people with cognitive disabilities. 508 had to abandon firm rules around cognitive issues because of the challenges addressing the wide variations in cognitive disabilities legally. The author argues guidelines will always have a limitation in solving problems for the full range of the users and of user needs and disabilities. Focusing on each person's unique needs and experiences variation is more productive than trying to universally accommodate all disability types. Flexible, modular web content that can be presented in different ways fits well with the idea of variation. Then it says variation ties together accessibility, disability theory, and new media theory in productive ways. Yeah, one thing I would say that I want to be careful with in these research sessions is to not get too down the rabbit hole of the sociological questions at hand, because there's so many. Like they even mention in the beginning of their article having a social model of disability. Yeah, and I don't exactly know what that is, but at the end of the day, what I do is pretty practical, and I definitely want some theory involved in that process. But I think it's important to let theory kind of enhance what your process is rather than perhaps lead it. That's great. Good start. So that's a good paper on that advocates for sort of, it said variation was the word it gave. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go to a really recent article and look up web accessibility history. Linked open images, visual similarity in the semantic web. Okay. That sounds interesting. I don't think it's quite what I need. The making of Black Lives Matter, a brief history of an idea. Accessibility and tourist satisfaction. Okay, this is not exactly what I'm looking for. I'll just look up web accessibility from 2023. Hopefully we'll get some cool stuff. Of educational institutions. Okay, so here's an interesting article. One thing that I am interested in doing is building a application that can actually help someone with an intellectual disability go to college. And I have a screen reader already. It's on my blog. I'm sure you can see it, where it takes a screenshot and then it reads out what's on the screen. But before it does that, it translates it to a fourth grade reading level, and then or whatever reading level you put in, and then it actually will read it back to you with text to speech. And I think what's interesting to me is that we expect college to be limited to certain types of people, but learning is learning. And if there's barriers in the way of that, I personally don't think that's necessary. And it's interesting. One thing I've learned is there are quite a bit of resources for people with disabilities going to college. And I think colleges see that as, a civil rights need themselves. So I don't think there's going to be any pushback, but I do wonder about using, a reading and even perhaps a writing aid through language models. I wonder if universities would be okay with that. I think they probably would, because just looking at the history of things, there seems to be a desire to err on the side of accommodation. And so I think it's an interesting test case. And, learning is learning. So I think we should be excited for that process. So right here, I just took in that article about evaluating web accessibility of educational institutions. And I just threw it through Claude without any prompt. So it read through it and just gave me some key points, which is very valuable. Let's look at the abstract, and then we'll take a look at what it provided. Okay. The World Wide Web serves as an excellent platform for information dissemination. Educational institutions such as universities are utilizing the web medium to reach their target audience in the post-COVID-19 scenario. So this is a 2020, well, I thought it was 2023, but it says 2021 here. It says accepted, accepted April 21, published May 21, so not that recent, but in post-COVID-19, the web has obtained an increased significance as it becomes the primary access channel to reach these institutions. In this backdrop, it becomes essential to analyze the accessibility of these sites for students with special needs. I do want to pause on that. I like to let the articles speak for themselves, but I mean, I remember myself as a 18-year-old being quite intimidated by these sites. And even as in 2020, I took an online class for Python in the fall from Miracosta, and navigating that website was pretty stressful, actually. Even as an adult and someone who's built, learning management system, content, like, and even websites and stuff, it was still pretty anxiety provoking, and it's scary because like you're trying to learn this new thing and you're also trying to learn this website and this new institution, and yeah, it really is a pretty significant barrier for special needs students if you're referring to intellectual and developmental disability, and I'm certain that's true for blind or deaf and hard of hearing. I'm sure it's also similar. Anyway, this paper presents an approach to compute the accessibility of web pages for persons with disabilities. A variable magnitude approach is proposed in this paper for the computation of accessibility barrier count as a combination of two different components. The proposed approach is experimented with top-ranked higher educational institution websites of India based on the inferences from the results and inputs received from students with disabilities. A set of suggestions have been compiled by this paper to minimize the barriers faced by persons with disabilities in consuming these web resources. I think the best thing for me to do here for Anthropic or for Claude here is to ask what the solutions are, and I'm sure that they'll be here, but I want to know the specifics. So it says method applied. So they're talking about the magnitude of accessibility barriers, and then suggestions are provided to improve accessibility based on feedback. Students with disabilities, these include alt text, keyboard navigation, custom color contrast, proper form structuring, etc. Yeah, so it's pretty important that websites are, one thing I think is interesting to talk about is standards. And when you are using like a screen reader, there's like literally the screen reader will tell you where content is on a page, and it's important for that website to be correctly formatted, or not even correctly, it's so much as just standard, right? So people know what to expect if they're not able to actually see what's going on. And then alt text is also helpful for screen readers. Now, for visual impairment, it's not exactly what I'm interested in, but it is interesting how I've noticed that web accessibility and visual impairment, it's probably one of the best. It's web developers have done a great job for visual disabilities for sure. So I'm going to ask here, are there any discussions in this paper about the needs of people with intellectual or developmental disabilities. And I think overwhelm is a pretty significant one that college websites can impose on people. And I think another interesting thing too is having a well-structured website for someone who is blind or visually impaired is a much different set of needs than for someone with an intellectual disability. They probably do have sort of a universal design, crossover where the Venn diagrams come together of needs, but it's unlikely that it'll help that much, I think, just in my thinking about it here. So this paper is mostly on physical and sensory disabilities, so I'm going to move on. Thanks, but no thanks. Okay, accessibility of university websites. So there's a few of these. Effective web maps. Okay, so let's say web accessibility, intellectual and developmental disabilities. Okay, and I'm saying since 2023. So if the phone were broken, I'd be screwed. Media use for people with disabilities in a digital era. Talking about blindness here in this little excerpt. Probably not what I want. I'm going to say just anytime. And it says web accessibility for people with cognitive disabilities, 2005. Okay, that's amazing how long ago that was. Understanding data accessibility for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Web accessibility design recommendations for people with cognitive disabilities. That might have been, that's interesting, 2007. I wonder about the history of those terms too, the intellectual and developmental disability versus cognitive disability. Web accessibility for people with cognitive disabilities, that was in 2015. Development of the Aspire web accessible guidelines for autistic web users. That's interesting. I kind of like that. I think what's helpful is seeing things that are specific. So if you see something for, autistic web users, they might have interesting things to say specifically about autism. If this ever loads. In fact, that might be a better research angle. There we go. So this journal is Autism in Adulthood. I don't know if I'm going to have access to this. I'm getting a lay summary. Okay, let's just look at the abstract because I don't think I'll have anything better than that, unfortunately. Okay. There's this group called the Academic Autism Spectrum Partnership in Research and Education, Aspire. They used a community-based participatory research approach to create a website to improve healthcare access for autistic adults. Interesting. So our guidelines are grounded in accessibility theory, had autistic end user involvement at all stages, and were empirically evaluated through a usability study and evaluation surveys. we incorporated what we learned into the design of the website and compiled the accessibility information into a set of guidelines. The guidelines offer recommendations for increasing the physical, intellectual, and social acceptability of websites for use by autistic adults. In the evaluation of the website, 170 autistic end users nearly all indicated it was easy to use, easy to understand, and important and useful. So they're all over 95%. 92% would recommend it to a friend. 95% would recommend it to a healthcare provider. There is no significant associations between usability and understandability and education level. Receipt of help using the website or device. We recommend using the guidelines to improve website accessibility for autistic internet users. So I'm looking for this Aspire. Here, I got a full text on this website. I'm looking for this Aspire guideline, but they don't seem to be putting it anywhere. Here it is, I guess. Okay. Why is this here? All right, so we have at the top here, I really just want to zoom in, but I'm not able to zoom in. There we go. Okay, here we go. So ideas from qualitative interviews about healthcare experiences and interactive website ideas. Website content. Okay, so it's giving a process for development of getting feedback, which is good. I'd like to see some examples personally, but so I think this is the website right here. So, I mean, I don't know. Thoughts? Is this actually good? So we have bigger font. As usual, accessibility things I enjoy. Because I want bigger font too. Sitemap. Okay. Yeah, I mean, this is something that I think their idea of getting feedback is very important. That's exactly what you need to do, because I wouldn't be able to, off the top of my head, understand exactly what someone with autism would need for a website. But one theory I have is, if we're thinking about accessibility, it's better to have really simple, small use cases. Like I've used an example quite a bit of having a screenshot and wanting to email that screenshot to somebody. So how do you go about screenshotting? Usually there's some barriers to that. How do you actually open up your email and open that up and find the email address of the person you need to email? And then how do you get that screenshot into the email? And then now with we're getting tighter and tighter spam filters, how do you get that screenshot into an email and send it out without Google declaring it spam or whatever client you're not client, whatever provider you're using for your email, if you're sending it to me, Google's going to be looking at it. So, yeah, I mean, it's a tough question. Even something as simple as that. And this website's great. I'm glad they got all that feedback. Let's go ahead and actually look at this document. If I have to do Control All to just copy everything, that'll be annoying. Whatever. I'm going to put this in the Claude. Okay, tell me best practices according to this article for building a website for someone with autism. This is interesting. Low contrast colors. I've seen people talk about high contrast colors for disability, so like for visual impairment. In fact, when I look at this, like I have a little bit of trouble reading web pages sometimes. Like the low contrast colors to me are quite annoying actually. And like this god awful gradient here, which I mean, it's just a style. I don't want to say anything mean about it, but that's interesting though. That makes sense that you would. That kind of goes back to like, you know, listening to the users and having some theory of what autism is and understanding what people need. Offer selectable color themes, including dark mode and light mode. Again, I would actually argue this is, well, depends on your situation, but my theory is that having settings like this, like the customization from the end user, is not necessarily a positive thing because it just creates more complication. Right here, they have these modes here, which is a great idea, and it really could be quite useful. Yeah, and this is actually just kind of a good practice, but like if you think about this from, like there's different ways, different disabilities, right? So with, this is for autism, but if this was for someone with a visual impairment, it would start out at high contrast light probably, and then it would not be, this is not really great for a screen reader because it would have to go through, I'm assuming, all of these things on the toolbar here, and then it would start going through and actually reading the article. One thing that's interesting too is there alt text for this? There is, right? So it says healthcare toolkit, whereas when that's the name of, it should say Aspire Healthcare Toolkit maybe. I don't know. I mean, I don't know what their idea was here, so I don't want to criticize. But again, it's just interesting how when you build a website for all different types of disabilities, sorry about that, versus if you build it just for one specific one, you make significant decision changes. Allow users to turn off styling and use plain HTML. Again, like there's plenty of, you know, people with autism that really could use this and it would be helpful, but also others that it could get in the way. And autism is such an interesting, you know, use case because people with autism are so different. So my specific students that I work with probably wouldn't want all these features. You know, if I was making a website just for one of them, I would ask them and bake it in, but anyway. Okay, so intellectual accessibility, use the simplest interface possible, support text with simple icons and images, clearly label all site features and navigation, provide concrete examples to explain abstractions, minimize scrolling so users aren't disoriented, show all main features up front, don't hide drop-down menus, be concise and specific in content. It's funny. What I've noticed is just like that's good teaching too. And as I've worked with, I work with some really high performing high school kids at Cosmos, UCSD, and those kids can benefit also from these same things, and I benefit from them too. And in college, it's funny how you get kind of this situation where everyone's trying to kind of be as convoluted and intellectual as possible, when in reality, good teaching and learning and just everything, simplicity is important. And that's something that I actually struggle with a little bit with my blog, because I just want to express myself and then, circle back to simplicity later, but which is fine. I think it's a good way to go. But, the really beautiful, elegant things are always very simple deep down, and they, you build on abstraction as you go. So those are just good things to do for everybody. And then lastly, social accessibility. Use clear, literal language without idioms or colloquialisms. Explain reasons behind any unusual instructions. Provide not sure options on forms instead of forced choices. That's an interesting point, actually. I've definitely seen that as a challenge at times. Provide not sure options. Yep. Organize complex info clearly in FAQ format. Define terms that have special meanings. Consider autistic culture and preferences in language and symbols. That's a curious one. Definitely interesting. By autistic culture, do they mean like deviant art or like some site that a lot of folks like? I mean, I don't know. I am curious what they mean by that. In fact, I actually will ask. What are autistic culture preferences in language? Because it's just like with autism, everybody's so unique. Like, I don't know how you can. I don't know. It's interesting. Like, what would be the culture? Identity first. Oh, I see. So, I see. So the current preferred language of things like, let's see, preferring identity terms like autistic, on the spectrum, or neurodivergent. Avoiding language with implying disease or cure. Saying autistic instead of with autism. Wait, avoiding that or saying it? Oh my goodness. I don't know what they want here. What's interesting, I mean, yeah, anyway, you got to keep up to date with what's appropriate, but avoiding functioning labels with like high/low functioning autism. Yeah, that's really interesting because the DSM, I think we're on the DSM-5 now. DSM-5 ASD. Yeah, so when we switch from, distinct categories of autism to a spectrum disorder, then you suddenly get, it kind of creates new language too, or new language needs, if nothing else. So that's interesting. But where am I at? All right, cool. Good resource. And a little bit of a counter argument to the ideas I'm developing about deep accessibility being about specific needs that are met through sort of deterministic programs where we bake in settings rather than have settings that are available for the end user to change. It's good to know I haven't done any web development for autism or for any other intellectual or developmental disabilities. So these are cool things to start with. So hope you enjoyed learning a little bit about web accessibility with me. And as I dive into these different topics, thank you.